sharing stories of faith, hope, and inspiration. This is the Sunday Blessings Podcast.
I'm Jay Hildebrandt, and this is the Sunday Blessings Podcast, and we're fortunate today to have Jason Gray with us. Jason is a contemporary Christian singer-songwriter. I'm sure you've heard of him if you're into the Christian music scene. He's on the radio stations. He's up near the top of the charts and has won several awards. So thank you, Jason, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Now, one of the
You make me sound pretty cool.
Oh, I know. That's the aim here.
Yeah.
So as far as our podcast is concerned here, we want to talk about a few things. But first of all, one of the reasons we're talking to you right now is an event that's coming up, although it will be in the past as some people listen to this podcast. But it's a concert to help fight homelessness in the Idaho Falls area. Tell us about that and how your feelings about the importance of doing that.
Oh, yeah. Caring for the poor has become my most meaningful worship personally, and that's because, at some point my theology shifted from some idea that my job as a believer was to behave, keep my nose clean, and bide my time until Jesus returned or I went to heaven, And at some point it moved away from that to more of an understanding that the kingdom of God is at hand, and that God, so the old idea is like a theology of evacuation and abandonment, right? This world is not my home, so we're going to leave it all behind. And it shifted to an understanding that, evacuation and abandonment is not usually how God works. He usually, his character is to break in and to break through and to redeem and to save, right? And so that moved my understanding to that my job as a believer is to become a doorway through which God enters the world around me, right? Mm-hmm. And then that was clarified a bit more as I read Matthew chapter 25, and Jesus is painting a picture of what it's going to look like at the end of days when we stand before God, and apparently we will be asked some questions, And what's interesting as we read through it is that we aren't asked any theological or doctrinal questions, which are the things that as Western evangelicals we can sometimes fixate on, right? Mm-hmm. We won't be asked, did you believe in infant baptism? Did you believe in the inerrancy of Scripture? Did you believe in the virgin birth? All those things are important, absolutely, but those aren't the things that God asks us in that moment. According to Jesus, he asks us, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? When I was naked and alone, did you clothe me? Did you visit me? And apparently we will say, Lord, Lord, when did we see you hungry, thirsty, naked, and alone? And then Jesus says, whatever you did unto the least of these, the poor, the powerless, the vulnerable, you did unto me. And in that moment, Jesus is declaring his solidarity with the poor, the powerless, and the vulnerable, and the suffering, which is good news, right? Because all of us have been some version of that at some point in our life, and to know that that when we are suffering, when we are in the midst of loss and catastrophe, when the whole world is moving away from us and discarding us, that's when God is closest, So that's a beautiful idea to me. And in the book of James, it says that true religion is this, that we look after the orphan and the widow. And so this kind of work, caring for the homeless, the poor, the powerless, the vulnerable, the orphan, the widow, I see it as our most meaningful worship. I've got a friend, actually. He's a worship leader at a big church. He's written songs for the Newsboys and for Chris Tomlin. And was hanging out with him a week ago, and I just learned that he bought a trailer and he put 12 washers and dryers in it. And so he leads worship on Sunday morning. And then after he's done doing that, he drives all of that downtown and he washes the clothes of the poor in downtown Nashville. And he says he does that so that he can lead worship in the morning and then he can go live worship. And I just thought, man, he's got something right there. That's beautiful, isn't it?
That certainly is. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, what great thoughts. I've heard too that it's how we treat people is the mark of a true Christian.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I focus on my Sunday Blessings program largely on music, along with these inspirational messages like you have just given us so powerfully. We appreciate that. So I just wanted to talk a little about music, your Christian music. First of all, how did you get started in writing and singing Christian music?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it goes back to I grew up on the road with my mom's bar band, and so I was a little boy and I was around a lot of music, and we didn't go to church. Nobody was talking about God or anything like that. But I did grow up around a lot of music. What that looked like is we'd haul all the gear into a converted school bus and drive all around Iowa and the Dakotas and up in Minnesota. Arrive at the corner bar, load everything in, and my mom would take the stage to sing the Eagles and Heart and the Doobie Brothers, and she'd stick me on a stool at the bar so she could keep an eye on me while she was working. And so there I was, a 5-year-old, just hanging out at the bar, right? And I remember I hated the smoke, but I had my bottomless glass of root beer and my Star Wars action figures, and the waitresses adored me, and it was a good life, And so I grew up around a lot of music, and I imagine that means, it's no surprise that the first time that I remember hearing God speak to me was through music. It was through a song by my favorite group. The first music I cared about was Simon and Garfunkel. And then after that, it was Kenny Rogers and then Kiss, but I'm not going to get into that part of my story. But early on, it was Simon and Garfunkel, and my parents were in the midst of a very ugly divorce, and I was caught in the middle of all that. And, we lived with my grandparents for a number of years. I didn't have my own room, so I'm sleeping on the couch every night. And my grandpa was a good man. In many ways, he was my best friend, but he was also an alcoholic. So there was a lot of chaos, a lot of volatility. And into all of that, God knew how to speak to me in a language that I would understand. And so it was that I was out doing an errand with my grandpa, and it was January up in Minnesota, so it was very, very cold. So he left the car running when he went into the liquor store. And I'm sitting in the car, the radio's on, and over the radio comes a song by my favorite group, Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Water. And I remember having this sense of peace come over me, and like there was a benevolent, loving presence in the car wrapping its arms around me, and as though it was saying, "Psst, hey, the words of this song that you love so much, this is my heart toward you." And the lyric, is, "When you're weary, when you're feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I will dry them all. Like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down for you." And I got that message, and I believed it. I didn't have the language then to say, I think God spoke to me, or so I don't think I could have made that up, because that idea wasn't on the menu for my experience at that age. So very early on, I experienced music as one of the ways that God speaks, and I always knew that I wanted to be a part of that.
Speaking of that music, then you decided to become a Christian singer-songwriter. I'm just curious how the message comes to you. Is it Jason Gray coming up with the lyrics? Did you ever feel with the lyrics and with the music that there's maybe something divine that is, and you're just the instrument?
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because um, we want to give credit where credit is due, and I think as believers we are terrified of being arrogant, and that's a good thing to be terrified of, right?
Hmm.
But at the same time, I was listening to an old interview with Rich Mullins, and he said, "All right, like if I were a car that Mr. Ford made, how would I bring Mr. Ford glory? By trying to be something I'm not, by going and conquering countries or being a house? No, I would bring him glory by being what he made me, a car. And so I've experienced that there is a freedom in just being me and being grateful for how God has made me. I think that He has tuned me to the world a certain way. There are things that I care about. There are things that make me mad. There are things that I notice, right? Just because of who He's made me. And a lot of my songwriter is just about paying attention to that. I was talking with my mentor recently. I want to do an album of songs about the church, for the church. And I was stuck, and he said, pay attention to the things that bother you. And that may be a song, you know,
Hmm.
because of the way that God has tuned you. Uh, he, you know, th- this little issue I see that I want to speak to. Maybe that's me being obedient. So that's I'm usually paying attention to what bothers me or what brings me joy, what delights me, you
Hmm.
know, and then I try to write from that place and trust that, oh, th- that's me being me, who God created, and I just I hope that pleases Him and brings Him glory.
Just for fun, I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, to choose one of your songs
Yeah,
that has a powerful message and tell me what that message is and how that came to you.
yeah. If I could only be known for one song, the one that I would pick, probably the one that I'm the proudest of, is a song called "The Wound Is Where the Light Gets In,"
Hmm.
and that language first came because I was reading a poem by the Persian poet Rumi, and the line was, "The wound is where the light enters you," and and our whole faith is built upon this idea that renewal comes from death and resurrection, right? Um, the wound is where the light gets in, and our experience too. I bet that you've gone through this. Everyone hearing this has gone through some great difficulty, and if you're hearing this, you've made it. You made it through, and on the other side of it, uh, on the other side of some great difficulty, we come out stronger, hopefully, wiser, hopefully kinder, more humble. Um, I wrote an album called Order, Disorder, Reorder, and that to me is really good language for describing the pattern of transformation, how God makes us new, right? Like we get some understanding and then we can kind of camp out there, but then it becomes idolatry and it becomes a rigid, closed way of thinking, and the Lord in His mercy has to send some kind of catastrophe to break that all apart, right? And disorder, but then in the aftermath of that, we come out wiser, right? And so I see God in every step of that process. I'm a recovering jerk. I'm not all the way recovered yet. I'm still a little bit of a jerk, but I'm a heck of a lot better than I used to be. And to whatever degree I am patient and loving and humble and to whatever degree I lack self-righteousness and arrogance, I owe it to the work that God has accomplished in me through disorder, through the hard times I've gone through suffering, failure. Failure is a good one, right? It's interesting, right? Because so much of religious instruction is geared towards helping us to not fail. And yet failure is one of the things that God uses most profoundly to change us, right? So sometimes it looks like our religious culture is kind of at odds with how God normally works or whatever, but I suppose we have to be taught to not fail, and that failure is something to avoid, so that then when failure happens, it's sufficiently catastrophic enough
Yeah.
to break us open, right?
Yeah.
So I guess they are working together. So.
Yeah. I heard one religious leader say, people might say, God, please take away all my problems, all my sins. Don't let me have to go through the kinds of things that you went through. But it's those things, like you say in that song, that really are what build people up. So I love what you said about that. Yeah. So
the wound is where the light gets in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And would you be okay if I played a little snippet of that on my podcast here?
I would be honored.
Okay.
I'd be so grateful.
You can recognize a saint by the scars they don't disguise. You can pick out a real sinner by the kindness in their eyes. So if you're stumbling in the dark and bleeding at the shin, remember the wound is where the light, the wound is where the light, the wound is where the light gets in. The wound is where the light, the wound is where the light, the wound is where the light gets in.
One final question. I know that you have a lot of things to do, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you at the end here, knowing your feelings about Jesus Christ, to share your witness and your feelings about the Savior and what he means in your life.
That's really good. I went through a really brutal divorce about 8 years ago, and it was very painful, very confusing. I didn't understand why it was happening. I didn't want it to happen. I'd always experienced God's faithfulness, that even if things were hard, he would save the day in the 11th hour. I know that God is not going to interfere with an individual's will, right? So I didn't expect him to rob her free will of her. And yet, at the same time, I felt very alone in that season, and I never prayed harder for anything in my life. And it just felt like I'd call upon the Lord, who I'd always had such a close, loving relationship with. And my experience was I just got a dial tone, and that really broke me and began to unravel my faith. And I wrestled with that for many years, and it continued to unravel until I completely lost my faith. And I just did not have belief in me. I remember a key moment, and I'd always enjoyed a very intimate, loving relationship with Jesus. It wasn't just a belief. I loved. I had an affection, and I felt his affection for me. That was all very real to me. I remember there's a camp that I work at every summer, and I was in the midst of this while I was out at that camp. The loss of faith, the loss of belief, and at the end of the camp, I'd been there for a month. I'm packing up. It's 1 a.m. and I decided to go out on the dock on the lake, the place I've gone to many times over my many years there, and it was often a meeting place, intimate meeting place for me and the Lord. And I went out there, and I didn't even have anything in mind. I was just going to go out there because it was the cool of the evening on a hot August day. And I went out there and I sat down, and it surprised me what came out of me. It just came out of me. And I said, I'm sorry, but I don't love you anymore. And the truth of it just kind of broke me. I was surprised by it, and I wept a little bit. And I got up and I went back to my cabin, and I thought in that moment that that was the end of something, that I was naming the end of something. And it was like the moment I said it, the light that had gone out inside of me, it came back on in a small way and began to grow again since then. So I would say that since then it's been growing again, my affection for him. But we've seen some times, and I still don't know if I completely trust him, at least not in the naive way that I did before, but it's growing. It's coming back, So I'd say that that's where I'm at. Yeah. It's growing again.
Great.
And I'm trying to trust him again. And he's demonstrating ways that I can that are very beautiful. He's coaxing me out of my my heart that got hard to protect myself from any more disappointment and pain. So,
wow. Well, we certainly appreciate you being so transparent about your feelings. I'm sure that this will touch people and help them along their faith journey as well. So, Jason Gray, thank you so much for joining us on Sunday Blessings today.
Thank you very much, Jay.
I'm Jay Hildebrandt.
Thanks for listening to the Sunday Blessings podcast. If you enjoy the show, please share, subscribe, and rate the podcast. Sunday Blessings is hosted by Jay Hildebrandt and is a production of Riverbend Media Group. For more information or to contact the show, visit riverbendmediagroup.com.